Hi and welcome. This week I'm taking a look at Moto Guzzi's 1400 California. This is a 2014 model. Now the California has quite a long history, and the first model was released in 1971, and that was the 850 GT, which utilised Moto Guzzi's loop frame of the era. It was followed in 1974 by the T3 California 850. That utilised the frame from the V7 Sport and Le Mans series of motorcycles. And that particular motorcycle, which was amongst Moto Guzzi's most popular, ran all the way from the 70s through to the 2000s with very little change apart from increases in capacity, braking and fuel injection. So when Moto Guzzi released the 1400 California in 2012, it was quite a departure for Moto Guzzi. This was a much bigger motorcycle. This motorcycle weighs around 317 kilos wet, so it's quite a large motorcycle and has quite a long wheelbase. The engine is a 1400cc engine. It's air oil cooled. It's a V-twin obviously, and has a displacement of 1380 cc's. This produces around 96 horsepower at 6,500 RPM. But of note, the actual torque of 88.5 foot-pounds comes in at only 2,750 RPM, and you certainly notice that on the road. The bore and stroke is 104mm by 81.2mm, and it has a compression ratio of 10.5 to 1. It's a single overhead cam, though in truth it's really a high cam, and it runs 4 valves per cylinder. And the transmission is a 6-speed with a hydraulically actuated clutch. Now the bike comes with cruise control, and there are 3 engine modes. It also has anti-lock braking, which you can turn off if you so desire. Now the 3 engine modes are Rain, Touring and Sport, and there's certainly a big difference between them. The Rain mode has a reduction in horsepower, but the main difference between the Sport and the Touring modes is the way the power is delivered. In Touring mode, it requires a lot more throttle travel, and it's a much more gentle delivery of power on throttle movement. Whereas once you put it into Sport mode, you certainly get quite an aggressive delivery of power on small throttle position changes. And that can be a little bit disconcerting if you're not expecting it. It's something that if you are going to use, you really do need to be acclimatized to the bike before you sort of put it into sports mode. What I found in most riding, the Touring mode was just fantastic. Now my first impressions of the bike were that the handling is quite light and nimble. It certainly changes direction once it's underway. At slow speeds, for example taking off and in roundabouts and doing U-turns, the bike with its mass and wheelbase is quite cumbersome. But once you get underway, the weight disappears and the bike truly comes into its own. You really only notice that mass when you're really trying to do slow speed maneuvers and you get into the really tight corners. Then it shows. But on long sweepers and on highways, you will find that the bike is really easy to ride. Now the seating position is a very traditional cruiser position. We've got an upright seating position with a low seat and pull-back bars. Now the floorboards on this are not quite as far forward as on some cruisers because the cylinder heads stick out a fair way, so it doesn't really allow you to put your feet right up the front of the motorcycle. But I didn't really find that a problem. It means that you had a more neutral position in your seating, and that really allowed you to explore the handling capabilities of this motorcycle. Now suspension-wise, we have a 46mm traditional fork at the front, which is manufactured by Satch, and that's a non-adjustable fork. But in saying that, I found that the factory settings that they've got in them were just perfect. It's certainly the front end soaked up bumps very well. There was no sign of wallowing or hopping, and that included a range of different speeds from slow to fast. So in my opinion, the front forks were pretty much perfectly set up for the bike. Now the rear suspension, we've got twin Satch shocks on the back, which are adjustable for spring preload and rebound damping. And when I picked the bike up, I found the rear end just a little bit underdamped and undersprung, but that was pretty easily adjusted. The damping adjustments can be done from the bottom of the shock there, and they're really quite simple to adjust to your requirements. I did find though that the rear end, being a twin shock design, is certainly nowhere near as good as a modern rising rate rear end. But again, it's not a deal breaker. The rear suspension did not bottom out, it did not do anything nasty. It just didn't have the feel of a modern rear end, but it was certainly excellent for a cruiser, and considering the couple of cruisers that I've ridden, I'd say this has probably got the best suspension of any of them. Now braking, we've got three 20mm disc brakes on the front with two 4-piston Brembo calipers that are radial mounted, and on the rear we've got a 282mm disc with a 2-piston caliper. Now the brakes are one of the standout features of this cruiser. This cruiser stops like no other cruiser that I've ridden. Those Brembos on the front there give you incredible braking power. Now the bike is also equipped with anti-lock brakings, which you can turn off if you so desire, but that gives you a good deal of comfort on the road, considering you've got a huge mass of over 300 kilos under you. Having anti-lock brakings could be a bit of a lifesaver in certain situations on wet roads or on gravel. Now the bike runs alloy wheels, the front one being an 18-inch and the rear being a 16-inch. The tyres on those are, on the front we've got a 130/70/18, and on the rear we've got a 120/60/16. Now the rear tyre is quite wide, but I certainly didn't notice any handling effects. This motorcycle carries the size of tyre really well through the corners. Now the controls are fairly standard. We've got very traditional sort of Italian good quality controls on the handlebars. The only difference being is there's a couple of mode buttons to operate the various rider modes and the cruise control. And in the centre there on the dash we've got a central LCD speedo surrounded by an analog tacho, below which are a number of idiot lights to indicate various functions on the bike. Now the finish of the motorcycle is certainly very good. We've got, on this particular one, it's in a silver paint job. This particular bike has done around 26,000 kilometres, so there's a few small scratches on it here and there, but it still shows that fine finish that would have come from the factory. The chrome looks really nice, the paintwork's well done. There's certainly a good attention to detail on this motorcycle. Now this particular bike comes with a couple of accessories that weren't on the bike originally. It's been fitted with Agostini mufflers, which certainly give it a really nice note on the road. They're not too loud once you're underway. They just lift the background note just enough to really give you that sense of riding a big V-twin, but it's not intrusive and certainly doesn't ruin your enjoyment of the motorcycle on long rides. The other changes that have been done to this particular bike is that the rocker covers have been changed out for those off a different model. The original ones would have just been plain silver, and this particular bike has also been fitted with heated grips. So who's this motorcycle targeted to? Well, it's certainly well and firmly entrenched in the cruiser segment of the market, and that is certainly a niche buyer's market, and really appeals to a fairly small number of people who are looking for several things. They're looking for a large motorcycle that has a lot of styling cues that hark back to days gone by, and they're looking for a large displacement engine that delivers a lot of torque. And this motorcycle certainly delivers a lot of torque. Now, interestingly, the engine has quite a large amount of vibration at idle, which you sort of think, wow, this motorcycle's going to vibrate a fair bit. But as soon as you open that throttle, the vibration almost disappears. The engine is not actually bolted directly to the frame. It's in a isolastic style mount, so that once you get underway, all those small vibrations disappear. Some may say it's probably a little bit too sanitised, but I had no issue with it. I found that the smoothness was certainly more than made up for by the incredible torque delivery, which, as I said earlier, comes in at sort of around 2,600 RPM where you get maximum torque. When you've got this motorcycle in sport mode and you open up that throttle, it really pushes you in the back. I mean, it's really quite impressive. But back to the sort of buyers that would be after this motorcycle, it's certainly not going to suit a small rider, even though it's got a fairly low seat height. In some respects, while these motorcycles reflect the cruisers of the past, weight-wise they are certainly a lot heavier than motorcycles were then. And one of the reasons, I believe, is because we in the West are a lot bigger than we were back then. I mean, you sit on some of those early Goldwings from the 1970s and they feel tiny today. And I can understand why with our Western diet and bigger stature, we're looking for a much larger motorcycle. And motorcycles like this, and this one in particular, are really good at eating up the miles on the freeway, doing the sweepers and similar sort of tasks. I'm not sure that I'd like to commute on it. I'm sure once you became used to the weight down low, you could probably commute on it quite nicely, but in the short time that I've ridden it, which has really only been an hour and a half, while I got used to the motorcycle quite well, I still had problems at slow speeds. It just felt a little bit cumbersome to me, but I'm sure with experience a lot of that will just disappear. But in conclusion, I'd like to say that the California 1400 is certainly worth a look if you're in the cruiser market, particularly the larger cruiser market. I mean, it has a statement all of its own, and if you're looking for an alternative to a Harley Davidson or an Indian, and you want something that has really good brakes and the prowess and handling of an Italian motorcycle, you know, this is something that you really should take a test ride on. And I have to say that even though this sort of motorcycle isn't for me, I thoroughly enjoyed riding it during the hour and a half that I rode it today. It was a real pleasure, particularly the torque out of this engine, which is quite addictive, I can tell you. And it's really easy to get up to illegal speeds if you're not keeping an eye on that speedo. Finally, I'd like to thank A1 Motorcycles in Ringwood, Victoria for loaning me this California 1400, and you'll find their contact details in the description below. I'll see you next time.